edition of Upfront, a monthly program produced by New Hanover County Schools. I'm Ann David. Each month here on Upfront, Superintendent of Schools Dr. Tim Markley answers direct questions from you, the public, about district-wide issues, accomplishments, and programs. There have been a lot of questions since our bond has passed. Viewers have a number of concerns about when construction will begin and much more. Then joining us on the show this month is a special guest, Judge Jay Corpening, Chief District Court Judge of New Hanover and Pender counties. He'll be joining us to talk about his effort to stop the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline, a trend that has been affecting minority students from age 14 to 21 in our area. But first, we welcome Dr. Markley and get back to those questions regarding the successful passage of the education bond. Welcome, Dr. Markley.
And it's good to be back. We're into our second semester now, and we are off and running.
Well, since we spoke last, the education bond successfully passed with flying colors. And if you can kind of give parents an update. Everybody wants to know what are the next steps.
Well, first you need to give yourself a pat on the back. You were co-chair of that committee, so I want to say thank you. And I want to say thank you to the almost 70% of the folks who voted for that bond. It was the largest bond in school history and passed by probably the widest margin in school history. So that was a real credit to what you folks did on the committee and the support that we have out there in the community. Now, in terms of where we're going, you've already seen some results. If you've driven by Laney, you'll notice the buses aren't parking between Laney and Trask anymore. They've moved up to the Sidbury Road complex, which we purchased. We've also started accepting names for the new Northeast Elementary School and have had hundreds of submissions, and we'll work on a process for narrowing that down. We have several items that have gone through the county commissioners for funding, so we'll start moving those forward. So you'll start seeing, it'll be slow, but then it'll start picking up pretty rapidly at that point. We're selecting architects for the high school projects, and we are moving a lot of the behind-the-scenes work before we actually start getting out there and pushing some dirt around.
Well, that's great. I know parents are very excited because if the funding was coming to their schools, they definitely wanted to see the dirt moving quickly. So construction will begin. Is there any projected date when the first construction will start? Well,
we need to select architects, and then we have to go through a design process, and that can be a little bit of a slow 6 to 12-month process. So our hope would be by the end of the year or the very first of the next calendar year, we'll start to see some of those buildings going up.
That sounds great. Well, I'm sure parents will keep an eye on that, and I'm sure they can update themselves through the school website.
Yeah, we'll keep our website up and posted with what's going on.
That sounds great. Now, I know that a new calendar has come out recently, the school calendar.
The new calendar looks a lot like the old calendar. It starts around the 25th and ends around the 10th of June. And unfortunately, there is not a whole lot of change in that calendar because it's a pretty inflexible process.
Right.
The big exception will be election days. We are working with the Board of Elections to make sure that on those countywide election days that our buildings are a teacher work day so that they can be used as voting facilities.
I remember that being an issue, and a lot of parents were very concerned that, especially elementary schools, were polling places. So our next big general election, will that occur?
Probably it'll be next one's will be one of the primary. Mm-hmm. Is when you'll see that'll actually come into effect next year. There were some issues with traffic at some of those schools. But I also think that schools, it's a civic process to vote. And by using schools, it maybe gives our kids an opportunity to go in before the voting starts and to get a feel for what that process looks like when the voters and citizens start arriving at those polls.
Absolutely, and it brings awareness to the students so they can learn about that process. And I know civics education has become very important in the curriculum.
Yes.
Now, there was some concern over driver's ed. I know funding has come and gone and come and gone. And what is the current state of driver's ed funding?
The state eliminated driver's ed funding, which was typically found under the transportation portion of the budget, not the education portion. And they have said that we can charge up to $65 per student. We've looked at our cost, and the best that we could get that down to is about $200 a student. So that means for us, somewhere between $500,000 and $750,000 shortfall to teach driver's ed in our schools next year, unless there's a change in the budget process this year. If that happens, we're going to have to dramatically curtail our driver's ed operations, limit access to those classes, and or take money that would have to go to instructional resources and use them for driver's ed. Neither of which solution is a great solution. we had a legislative breakfast, and our message to legislators was one of two choices. Either restore the funding, we'll continue to teach driver's ed, or if you don't want to put the funding back in, allow us to charge what it costs to teach driver's ed. Either one of those solutions we think is a workable solution.
So the upcoming driver's ed will...
It's good through probably June, but in the next fiscal year in July, we're going to, if there's no change in the budget, then we're going to have to look at a considerable revamp of our driver's ed program.
Okay, so that's something that upcoming driver's ed students need to keep an eye on, because I know they'll be signing up soon for the summer sessions of driver's ed. Well, those wrap up some of the initial questions we have, so we're going to go to a break, and then when we come back, Judge Jay Corpening will join us to discuss the sobering topic of schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline that has been plaguing our area minority students. So don't go away, we'll be right back.
I hope you find a home. I hope you find a home. Hey, maybe you'll be picked next. Maybe you'll be picked next. We've been caged together too long. We've been caged together too long. How come nobody ever picks me? Maybe they're looking for somebody different. Pick me. Well, the shelter's closing up for another day. We didn't get picked. I know. Tomorrow. Guaranteed.
Welcome back to Upfront with the Superintendent. Across the country, including right here in New Hanover County, school systems are shutting the doors of academic opportunity on students and tunneling them through into the juvenile criminal justice system. The combination of overly harsh school policies and an increased role of law enforcement in our schools has created a school-to-prison pipeline in which punitive measures such as suspensions, expulsions, and school-based arrests are increasingly used to deal with student behavior. And the huge number of youth are pushed out of school and into our prisons and jails. Joining us this month to talk about this issue and how to stop this trend is Chief District Court Judge Jay Corpening. Welcome, Judge.
Thanks, Ann.
How are you today?
I'm great. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are so glad to have you, because this is such an important issue. And I know a lot of people think about it, but it's something that up until now doesn't really seem to have been discussed a whole lot.
It hasn't been talked about a lot here until I guess Dr. Markley and I started talking about it a year and a half ago or so, and finally got a chance to start working on this last May.
Well, before we get into the details and statistics and the information that you have for our parents, let's just let our viewers know a little bit about you, because other than being a judge in New Hanover County, you are also one of our school's greatest volunteers. And
thanks.
So you're not just speaking to this topic from the judge's bench, you're speaking to this topic from actually having been in our schools and volunteered at our schools and been in one-on-one contact with all of our students. So if you could just kind of let us know some of the things you've done. How did you get started? I know initially it probably was as a parent.
So I got started as a parent when my oldest went to Winter Park Elementary. Serving on PTA, reading in the classroom. I started tutoring reading with the good folks from Wesley Methodist Church who've been going to Winter Park for years and tutoring kids in reading. And then we got a new principal, Julia Davis. I was president of the PTA that year, and Julia wanted a way to get to know the parents. And so she asked me if I would join her and greet the parents in the mornings there on McMillan Avenue and open car doors. That was 21 years ago. And so I've been through Winter Park and Roland Grice, and spent 10 wonderful years at Hoggard, Holly Tree, getting ready to graduate from the second time from Roland Grice and headed back to Hoggard next year. Lots of work on PTAs, lots of work going into classrooms and talking with students, sometimes even talking to grade levels, particularly in middle school.
Now I know from the bench you handle all the juvenile cases for our county.
I do. In December, I started handling all of our juvenile delinquent, our abuse, neglect, dependency cases through DSS, and termination of parental rights cases.
And as chief judge, this was your choice then to make this assignment, so it must be near and dear to your heart.
It's been near and dear to my heart my whole career. When I was in private practice, I served as attorney advocate for the guardian ad litem program in juvenile court when it was a pilot program in 1983, and I stayed with that program until I went on the bench in '91. So I've always been involved in juvenile court through my career, and this was an opportunity for me to spend some years focusing full-time in that work, and it fits so well with everything I do in school that it seemed like a logical match.
But now your switch to handling just juvenile cases, you have been interested in the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline long before that progression.
Absolutely.
Can you kind of give us the aha moment for you when you felt like this was a step you needed to make?
The aha moment was in 2012. Chief Justice Sarah Parker asked me to go to a school justice partnership summit in New York City. She knew about my interest in schools and my work in schools, and asked me to go along with a few other team members from North Carolina. And I listened to a guy named Steve Teskey, who's a juvenile court judge in Clayton County, Georgia, speak about this issue. In fact, several other folks spoke about this issue at that summit. And as I listened to the results from their work in Clayton County and in some other places where he had been to help them start efforts, I thought, why not here? Why not here? Our kids need help. We need to improve some of the ways we handle exclusion from school, particularly kids who are getting charged and arrested and sent to court. The taking responsibility piece is delayed so much, and if we can find a way to effectively deal with that in school first, then we'll be more effective.
So when you returned from that conference, what was your first logical step?
So I came back, I read some stuff about it, and then I called my friend Tim Markley and said, can we meet for coffee to talk about this? And he said, sure. And we agreed at that point to try to start an effort here to put together a group from schools and justice to see if we could come up with our own agreement to how to handle these cases in a formal way so that we had consistency across the board.
And what were some of with the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline, what are some of the triggers that make this happen? So
in cases where kids used to be automatically charged, and the root of all this dates back to zero tolerance. Zero tolerance started in the drug war in the 80s and then was exacerbated in the school setting by Columbine, where if kids committed a crime, then they were automatically charged. We've been better here about that than some places. But the trigger is a kid gets in a fight, is involved in a simple assault, other minor offenses, stole something, damaged some property that's minor. The trigger is that event occurs, and then the response is that interventions are put in place in school to address the behavior in an effective way instead of putting the behavior out of school.
So the initial problem where schools were sending students to jail, that's where the problem started. The harsh rules and the harsh punishment didn't give them any alternatives.
So the zero tolerance led to the kids being put out of school.
Right.
The effect of that was that the research has shown that once they started being charged and sent to court, they're more likely to come back to court again, and then they're more likely to come back again, and then they're more likely to end up in prison. Sadly, our criminal justice system doesn't do a whole lot to help deal with behavior in a positive way, especially for our students who are 16, 17, and 18 or who are going to our adult courts. We do a pretty good job with young people that are under 16, but the data's still there that once they start coming, they're more likely to continue to join us.
And I think a lot of parents are probably surprised at the 16. I think they probably think that most juvenile offenders stay that way until they are 18. So that really jumps some very still young students into adult court.
And it makes this work even more important for North Carolina, I think. You know, North Carolina is one of 2 states in the entire country that treat 16-year-olds as adults. Only 2 states. That's not something to be proud of, I don't think. There's been some effort to reform that and some general agreement to reform it, but our lean budget years have led to some challenges in making that change.
Well, as we now have a basis for the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline, we're going to take a quick break and then come back, and we're going to go into this more in depth. And what Hanover County Schools is looking at doing to make a change and to help these students succeed.
Absolutely.
And not head to the jailhouse. So
Great.
don't go away. We'll be right back and we'll have questions and more discussion with Judge Corpening. But if you have a question that you want the superintendent to answer about our school system, we've got the information for you right now. So get out a pen and some paper and jot down these details.
If you would like to have your questions about issues relating to our school system answered by Dr. Markley, then visit our school system's website at www.nhcs.net and click on the Parent tab, and then click on the Superintendent on the left side of the screen. There you will find a submission form for your questions. You can also send your questions by mail to New Hanover County Schools, attention Upfront, 6410 Carolina Beach Road, Wilmington, North Carolina, 28412.
Barry, time is running out. According to my calculations, 1 in 5 kids in America struggles with hunger. How can so many children face hunger when there's more than enough food to feed them all?
Babadoo.
You're right, Barry. We can help solve hunger by teaming up with Feeding America to get food to hungry kids in communities across the country.
Help Flint and the Feeding America network of food banks get food to the people who need it in your community. Find your local Feeding America food bank at feedingamerica.org/hunger.
Together, we're Feeding America.
Welcome back for our final segment here on Upfront. Our special guest this month is Judge Jay Corpening, Chief District Court Judge. He's been working with the Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Tim Markley, to help break the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline that has slowly begun to become a problem in our area. Now, before we went to break, Judge Corpening and I were covering some of the basics on how he got involved in this movement and why the school system is so important to you. Now, let's go back to the program itself and what are the next steps to put this in place and to help these students succeed and not feel like that crime and the jailhouse is their only option?
So as we started our process, when Dr. Markley and I first talked, we thought we were going to be able to get started on this process. Sandy Hook happened. Our district attorney, Ben David, convened a school safety summit, and that launched the work of our Safer Schools Task Force that took about a year. But then last May, we were able to finally come together with our multidisciplinary group, representatives from the schools, from the justice system, from the community. We actually brought Judge Teskey here. The Annie Casey Foundation paid for Judge Teskey and his team to come from Clayton County, Georgia. He brought his superintendent of schools, his I think he called him his police chief, the guy who's in charge of the school police there in Clayton County, his chief of staff, and his system of care coordinator, which is different than our system of care, but his system of care coordinator. They spent a day with us doing strategic planning about how we should approach our process. It was a very powerful day. Judge Teskey said that he paid us a real compliment because he said that in most places that he had been, they spent that day fighting because everybody was trying to protect their turf. And he was amazed as there were smiles around the table and that people were already willing to work together to accomplish goals, and so he felt like that was a big benefit for New Hanover County. From there, we began meeting as a group. We looked at some sample memorandum of understanding from around the country, other places that have been doing it. Connecticut schools, Broward County, Florida, which is Fort Lauderdale, had done it. Denver Public Schools, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and some others. We looked at work that had already been done. Jana Robertson from the Watson College of Education and I put together a draft using the best of some of those agreements. And then our group sat down and started going through the drafts, trying to pick what worked best for New Hanover County. Some of it is identifying a purpose and actually establishing what the purpose of the agreement is. Part of it is to establish focus acts that are behaviors that once would have resulted in charging and instead, pursuant to this agreement, result in interventions being put in place in school to immediately address the behavior. You know, when we send children home from school, when we put children out of school, whether we're charging them or suspending them, many of these children are being sent to the street. There's no one at home. And they're at risk when they're on the street. And you have to have had your head in the sand not to have seen the tragedy that's playing out in our streets where young people are killing each other and trying to kill each other. So a lot's at stake. But the details of the agreement are a guide for the different school sites in our system to begin to put interventions in place and to develop their own interventions based on resources that they have on site, based on their school personnel who may have special gifts, special talents. I'd love to see restorative justice put to use. We've actually got some young lawyers in Wilmington who are willing to volunteer in the schools doing restorative justice models to try to help with this.
And could you explain that?
Sure.
What is
So the restorative justice process involves bringing offender and victim together, and in the school setting with their families and with a trained facilitator to take a journey to have the offender be able to accept responsibility for the wrong that he or she had done, and to have the victim accept that and forgive and move on. Saw a powerful informal model of this just last week in one of my juvenile court cases. 2 young girls had gotten in a horrible fight at school. One of the school personnel had gotten in the middle of it, actually got injured. It was a terrible fight. The mothers said enough. They got together, they called each other. They got their girls together. They made them sit down together, and the 4 of them worked it out. So now the students are at Pathways, I think. They're sitting beside each other, they're best friends. It works, it truly works. And it's one of the most powerful ways for students to actually accept accountability. Putting them out of school, whether it's through charging or through suspension, doesn't address the accountability issue. It doesn't address necessarily reforming behavior. What we want is the behavior to change.
Absolutely. And you know, we already have functioning teen court, which does, I know they are first offenders, but something of that nature would also help.
Teen court is one of the interventions that would be used. I called Sheila Evans when I came back from that summit in New York City. I said, brace yourself, we're gonna have some more business for you. And one of the first things that we did was change some of the classes of offenders that were eligible for teen court. She's bursting at the seams now, which is a wonderful problem to have because it's such a powerful model.
Oh yeah. And just as an aside for those folks that maybe do not know what teen court is, the attorneys, the jury, and basically all the functioning bodies except for the sitting judge are students that volunteer. Our future lawyers, I suppose.
Students that volunteer, and some of the students who've been through as offenders, who've accepted responsibility for what they've done, come back as part of their service and sit as jurors, then helping decide the punishment for some of their peers.
Which is huge, because I think if the students know that they are having to answer to their peers, it's a stronger message sometimes than even having to answer to adults.
It really is, and the judge doesn't do the sentencing. The judge just is in there and the judges are some of our young lawyers, and they do a fabulous job in working with these young people. But the jury, the students, establish what the punishment's going to be within a range of punishment that's been provided, which is a very powerful model.
Now, with all the systems that you've looked at in putting together a model for New Hanover County, what are their statistics and data with what they have seen? So
at the foundation of this is disproportionate minority contact. We see our children of color excluded more often, substantially more often. Whether they are black, Hispanic, the minority children are excluded more often and end up in jail more often. So in Clayton County, the project began in 2003. When they looked at it about 6 years later, they found that yes, the number of arrests were down, but that was intentional. They were suppressing the number of arrests by saying, you can't arrest, you've got to do interventions. What was also down was incidents at school. The incidents of the misbehavior that would qualify as a criminal offense was down substantially. Even though they weren't addressing weapons on campus formally, there were less guns in school, less knives in school. The suspensions dropped, even though that wasn't part of the formal agreement. Suspensions dropped. Graduation rates went up, dropout rates went down, schools were safer. As Judge Teskey said, who would have thought that keeping kids in school would help improve graduation rates?
So the results were remarkable. They were more than what they had anticipated.
So the results are so remarkable that Judge Teskey now is traveling all over the country, meeting with groups just like ours, trying to help school systems develop their own collaborative agreements. He was in Seattle, Washington recently. He has been back to Connecticut to do some more work with them. He was somewhere else in Florida. It wasn't Broward County, somewhere else in Florida recently. I told you he spoke in 2012 at the summit. Some of us from New Hanover County went to a national summit on school climate and discipline in DC last October. He spoke there. The model works, and he is in high demand, and the fact that other folks are doing it means that it really is an issue. If we can get this agreement wrapped up, we'll be the first in North Carolina that has one. Mecklenburg County is the only other county that's really working on one in detail like this, and they're in process as well. So I think we actually have the opportunity to be on the cutting edge of something.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, our time is getting short. We still have a few minutes. Is there something you would like to do and wrap up to let parents know where we're going from here with the program on the move, and how do we get started to have this successful results?
So once we have the agreement ratified, once the board, I'm meeting with the principals on this Thursday morning, February 5th. Once we do that, then I have hopes that we'll take it to the Board of Education for approval. Then we'll have a big signing party that we're looking forward to planning. And then once that happens, then we'll work on training school personnel about developing interventions, about how to implement this process. One of the keys is developing the interventions, which is why I'm excited about trying to bring restorative justice folks to help and volunteer.
Is there any way, if we have community leaders or just community members in general, or parents that would like to get involved, can they email you at the court system, or what's the best contact?
They can email me. Once we roll out, where we need community folks and where we need parents is in their schools. Community folks who are in their school districts. We've already got a church on the north side, Warner Temple, that's partnering with New Hanover High School in a great program that's not costing any money and that's helping cut down suspension time for kids. And that's a community partnership. And so community partnerships are at the foundation of this. So as we roll out, there'll be a lot of publicity that we're rolling it out. And that's when parents and community folks can get in touch with the schools and offer to help. Our kids are worth it. They are. And if you want to see what Wilmington is going to look like in 10 years, take a tour of our high schools, because that's what Wilmington is going to look like in 10 years. So I think it's worth stepping in and spending some extra time and making some extra effort to try to support our children.
Well, thank you, Judge. And this program is so worthwhile. I hope that when everyone hears that it has now become a reality, that they will step up and step in and help all of our schools to help these children and all our children succeed.
Thanks. I hope so too.
Thanks for coming today.
My pleasure.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Upfront. Now look for a new edition of our program each month of the traditional school year right here on the Learning Network of the Cape Fear, Time Warner Cable Channel 5 and Charter Cable Channel 191. On behalf of Dr. Markley and the staff here at NHCS TV, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next month for another edition of Upfront with the Superintendent.